Okay, I'm very curious in the essence of your work. What's for you? What's the essence of your work?
The essence of the work is being an outsider on theology and history. My first degree, my doctoral thesis, was in the Irish Civil Service in the 19th century, which is very, very specialist. But when I came over to Catholicism in 1980, I shifted all my writings and started into the area of liturgy. And the study of liturgy from a sociological point of view formed the basis of my first book that was published in 1991. And since then, I've done 3 other books on the project of using sociology to open out theological meanings in modernity. And I've edited 3 books with a colleague of mine, Peter Job, and these were on postmodernity, on virtue ethics, and the sociology of spirituality. So we're rather close to a marketplace. But if I had to characterise my work, I'd say that it was field work in theology, where one is looking on the ground of culture and modernity to pick up theological resonances that can be extended in ways that are highly orthodox.
Mm-hmm. You wrote also about martyrdom?
I'm editing a special issue of mortality with Peter Job, and we also are thinking about a book on martyrdom. It's a completely unexplored area in sociology of religion. Largely it relates to Islam, but to Catholicism, very, very remarkably little is done on it, even though it's an extremely interesting, fertile area, because it relates to altruism, forms of sacrifice that go against the tide of secularization, as people who lay down their lives for a difference in religious belief. That they act on the religious belief in a way that the present culture of secularization finds very, very difficult to understand. The cause is religious, not political.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and Keith, well, tell me about your work.
Well, my background is I'm a sociologist. I was trained as a sociologist, but I was trained as a specific kind of sociologist, and the kind of sociology I do as a critical sociologist. What I'm interested in, and what my work has always been about, is using culture, using cultural texts to try to lever open common sense. So I use cultural texts like film, art, film, for the most part, to launch an investigation into essentially what does it mean to be human in this historical situation. And how is that way of being human naturalised? How does it become common sense? But can it be different? Is there a possibility of a different way of being human? So that's been the long-going thread in my work. I mean, Kieran mentioned when you came over to Catholicism.
Yeah.
For me, when I came over, to use Kieran's phrase, there was a change in my work, because it seems to me that doing critical cultural sociology, asking questions all the time, gets you so far, but ultimately you end up at a point of almost, so what? So yes, I know things can be different. and the change that coming over made to my work was it gave the critical investigation more of a purpose. The first sign of that, I think, is a book I wrote about Eric Romer, the French film director, where using his films as a way of looking at the world, because his films are very slow, they're very carefully organised, and they require us to look very, very closely at the film. And he always gives us a choice about what to look at. Do we look at the main characters or at ones at the side of a screen? What Romer's films did was show to me that close looking also raises questions, but we need to be aware of what we're looking at. Or specifically, we are looking at humans. We are looking at a human world of human relationships. And that then became a purpose, or kind of became an end point of the questioning. That became what the questioning was for, rather than just intellectual hijinks of, yes, let's question everything,
Mm-hmm.
and we end up nowhere. Recovering what it means to be human, and then other questions and coming on from that. So, as I say, that's what my work has always been about and is about.
Yeah, so theology would be something that provides you with more sociological questions. That would be questions of liturgy, ritual, modernity, mortality, but also of purpose and being human. And I'm interested whether is there any place in your work for the thought of JP2?
The difficulty of John Paul II is that he really is a mold breaker in terms of culture, in terms of Poland itself, his contribution to solidarity, the ending of Marxist rule, so that he's an object of sociological interest, not a subject. The problem with him is that he really is writing in the context of the after effects of Vatican II. That Vatican II was a breaking open to the world without a means of understanding that world. So one of the things that I think John Paul II does is that, especially Fides et Ratio, is he invokes philosophy, his trade, into the dialogue with the world, so that theology presupposes a dancing partner. The difficulty is that the dancing partner is philosophy, not sociology, because reading Fides et Ratio, one sees him invoking philosophy as a means of reading culture. Nobody, I think, in sociology would accept that. But on the other hand, there is another side to John Paul II in terms of his stress on the culture of death, which I think is probably much deeper resonances in terms of abortion, in terms of life, in terms of euthanasia. And I think that contribution is the one that probably will be the most long-lasting. When you evaluate John Paul II, I know it might be unpopular to say so, I think actually one must link him to the previous Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger. That the achievement of both of them, to my mind, the long-lasting one, was the writing of the Catholic Catechism. And the Catholic Catechism had a very, very profound effect of settling Catholicism down to its own identity and giving to laity a means of checking who they are, what they're accountable to, so that it wasn't a redress of Vatican II, it was a completion of Vatican II in terms of laying down a theology for the modern world. So in that context, if you take the two together, they were really massively great popes. So that the history, of course, remains to be written of both of them. But they are different personalities who complemented each other remarkably.
And Keith?
I'm just pausing here. I mean, I just want to situate my own work in relation to Kieran. So, forgive me if I totally misunderstand, but to my mind, your work is about a dialogue between sociology and theology.
Yes.
And you're kind of at the buffer point where the two meet.
Yes.
My work isn't. I come from a sociological background where there are certain questions we as sociologists specifically, can't possibly address. That's so the point I made earlier about my work being about critical questioning. Sociology can take us to the questions. It can open up the questions. It can't really go beyond that. So for me, theology is what goes beyond sociology. So it's almost as if I approach sociology as kind of a little bit there, and theology is the shell of the nut of sociology, as it were. Yeah, that's the right way around. So what this means for my own work is that there's less of a kind of positive concern with theology, because I'm quite careful to situate my own work as a sociological project. The theology is beyond that, and I don't feel especially competent to go there. The example, or John Paul II, however, has had a huge impact on my work, but it's been a huge disturbing impact, which I don't think I would ever be able to play out. And the disturbance is this. So, to my reading, I started reading John Paul II as a sociologist. I was interested in him sociologically. He puts ethics on the agenda. Ethics becomes central to what it means to be human. That's one thing. But the other thing that John Paul II did, and one of the great messages I took from his work, was the question of hope. And as a sociologist, sociologists don't do hope, do they? Sociologists do pessimism, despair, and apocalypticism, if such a word exists. You know, we do everything's awful and it's going to get worse. John Paul II gives hope, and hope doesn't rest well with sociology. So for me, John Paul II, I think his work it's a provocation. It's provoking me. Don't go for the easy sociological answer that everything is awful, because actually there's hope. You've got to find it, you've got to work on it, but it isn't all just awful. Yeah. So I think that's what I take from his work.
I'm interested in that sphere between theology and sociology. What's the resonance of your work in the UK and also beyond? So are you a sociologist, are you a theologian, or theologian for sociologists, sociologist for theologians?
It's a very difficult question to answer because I don't know who I am to the two disciplines. I tend to fall down the middle. I'm a very dense writer with a very big range, so that the difficulty is that the amount of sociology is large, I think. I'm pretty got the fingerprints of a sociologist. But the difficulty is that I'm using the fingerprints on a hand, the stretching it to theology. And this, for many sociologists, is the most peculiar exercise. For theologians, it's even more peculiar that a sociologist is coming back with specific theological questions that are often unfashionable and difficult to answer. There's a very funny tension between sociology and theology, that sociologists tend to be, when they write in areas of theology, tend to be much more hardline, so that they would be working on things like evil or hell, or they'd be working on the corruptions of modernity, whereas on the other hand, theologians are much more an affirming approach to these things, a much more hopeful version. So the issue really oscillates between who has the real version. And the problem I have in my writing is that I'm on my 5th book at the moment and working on the area of post-secularity. And I'm trying to work around testimonies within the world that cause people to have second thoughts about theological issues. Because when you look at the world, it is extremely ordered. You go to Warsaw, it's got boulevards, it's got cafes. It is an ordered world. But it's a world that actually disguises itself with the expansion of visual culture. And visual culture in particular expands with the internet. And people really haven't grasped what it is to be a spectator, a looker. And that world has shifted in modernity in ways that have enormous theological complications. So that looking relates to more than, and the more than lies in my current interest, the chapter I'm writing on ruins and cathedrals. So the ruins are spectacles, they're enigmatic, but they point to something beyond. You cannot demolish a ruin, you can simply go and look at it. It doesn't mean that my theology or any theology is based on ruins, but it's a very good example of ruins being a thin end of a wedge into something else. And the something else lies in the biblical accounts of ruins, where in the Psalms pleading is made to the Lord, we are in ruins, what are you doing? So that the ruins force out a theological question about fate, about things being fixed, which are not, which relate to God actually returning to rebuild. And the ruin actually, of course, lies in the notion of Christ, of the stone being rejected, the cornerstone, things being demolished but rebuilt. So that is to argue that the world is more fleeting and contingent than it likes to believe. And it's that fleeting and contingency that enables sociology to have a common cause with theology in addressing wider and more enduring issues. The difficulty is that we're locked in what I call an eternal present. The present seems to be fixed. If you go back to 2008 or 2007, the world was fixed in a particular way. That world has changed with austerity, mass youth unemployment, disillusion about politics, cynicism. All these things are there to be captured and caught. So that the more you pick out the world shifting, the more somebody's got to work at putting down the compass points and saying that the compass points provide means of reading a map that have theological implications.
Mm-hmm. So we are together for a walk in Warsaw, and I didn't think of Warsaw as a city of ruins, but you were interested in those pictures.
Yes. Yes, the ruins are rebuilt. I mean,
Yeah.
Warsaw is a very, very good example of not being able to go back to the original past. It cannot, the buildings are gone, but it can actually rebuild in ways that give people an identity. And it's that process that relates to theology. So the theology, in the world it lives in, appears to be disappearing, disintegrating, because of secularization. Mm-hmm. But the argument one would make is that when you look at the broad sweep of history, the genius of theology, which sociology recognizes, is this capacity to reinvent, mm-hmm. to rebuild, so that to that degree it complements the notions of hope. Mm-hmm. That in my sociological writing, I've never found anything of any description that has unsettled my faith. Mm-hmm. My difficulty is that I'm like G.K. Chesterton. I understand orthodoxy. I don't understand unorthodoxy.
Keith, you know who you are. You are a sociologist.
Yes. That's a label I apply to myself, but I mean that in a specific way. So mm-hmm. I think that certainly in the UK, were I to tell other sociologists that I'm a sociologist, I think they would deny this.
Really?
Sociology means different things, so it can mean either the academic discipline of sociology, what goes on in sociology departments, which, if I'm being brutally honest, I'm not terribly interested in. A lot of what goes on in sociology departments, if you forgive me, is trivial, uninteresting, and statements of the obvious. But sociology can also mean the practice of an imagination, a way of thinking, a way of looking at the world. That's what I'm interested in. So perhaps it's better to say that I'm not a sociologist. Perhaps I should nuance it. I'm not a sociologist. I am sociological. But perhaps that's a better way of doing it. And that using being sociological, thinking about what it means to be human in a specific historical context, what possibilities that opens up, what possibilities that denies, that then does open up a whole range of other issues and a whole range of other agendas, and obviously specifically I think in a theological direction. My sociological training was, unlike, you clearly have a background in theology as well.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, you're widely read in it,
yeah.
And you see it's relevant. My sociological background was one which was entirely within secular knowledge, entirely. So for me, the kind of lesson that John Paul II taught was there is another way of looking, another way of thinking. And this is then where, to go back to my earlier point, I'm interested in film, in particular the work of Eric Romer, a Catholic filmmaker in France, died 3-4 years ago, if that long ago. As I say, his films are all about looking closely, and then attending to the interrelationships. What's missed? What do the characters miss? What do you, as a member of the audience, as a spectator, what do you see? And he doesn't give you the answers. So what his films are, they're kind of exercises in the virtue of paying attention. That's essentially how I see his films. So you asked Kieran, your first point was about kind of how your work is read and so forth, wasn't it? So I came over, to go back to that phrase, in 2006 to the church. Obviously, there had been a process going on before then, but I kept that in pretty much entirely to myself. Before 2006, I had published quite a lot of work. That is the work that is still addressed. My work since then, if I'm being totally honest, is either ignored or completely misread, as I see it. Utterly misread. But what is very noticeable is that sociologists do not spot what seems to me to be the obvious theological inflection, or opening, rather, in my work now. So, to go back to Roma, I wrote a book about him. The commentary on that book, the comments I've received, are purely of, so you identify Roma as a Catholic. End. That's it. So he just happens to be one. It's an accident of biography, but then you go to discuss his films. To my way of thinking, what the book is actually about is saying the key to understanding his work is the fact he's a Catholic. It's not a biographical accident at all. He was actually practicing Catholicism almost through the medium of making film. That was part of his...
Medium is the message.
No, the medium is the way to the message. Not the medium is the message. The medium is the way to the message. So the purpose of the medium is to provide you with a way of getting to the message. But I'm not going to tell you what the message is, because you've got free will. You're responsible. You are an ethical being. So I'm leaving it up to you to work out what the message is. So to my way of thinking, his films aren't... It's not an accident. It's not a mere coincidence of biography that they are how they are. But that's how his films are usually read. That's certainly how my book is read. That I mention it in the introduction. He was a Catholic. I'll give a quotation from him, and then that's okay. We'll pass that over. That's a bit embarrassing. We won't talk about that anymore. Let's talk about the films. So yeah, I like your phrase. The kind of medium is the message. Yes. So. But the message, as I say, is beyond the medium. The medium is the way to the message. Yeah, the medium is the means by which we can get from here to there, so to speak. Yeah.
There is another point actually, which is very important to add, at least to me, that when you're a writer, you're quite often uncertain of the effects of what you write. In terms of my own writing, I've been reviewed quite widely. If I go into Google, I find myself slightly embarrassed that I'm virtually the only person working in sociology and theology in the world. And this makes it all the more difficult, because you find it very hard to evaluate your writing. But there's a very important point about the identity that one brings to what one writes as a sociologist. Keith says that he prefers to be considered sociological. I make no bones that I am a sociologist, simply because all my ancestors, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Simmel, Goffman, who I'm very much influenced by, were all incomplete in their sociology. That there was great dispute as to whether they were sociologists. So the sociology is a sort of an incomplete discipline that has a certain anarchy of identity, but nevertheless sociologists speaking to each other have a common currency of their ancestors. They have a common currency of seeing the world in particular ways that marks them out. So that if I speak to Keith in a way, I'm on a wavelength, that if I speak to a theologian, I'm not on that wavelength. One day they don't understand where I'm coming from. He does. My colleagues do. The difficulty they don't understand is where I'm going to. And the theologians are even more baffled that anyone would want to get to that end by that route. It's the route that causes the problem. So rather like Keith on his message, on the medium, and the route. The route is highly unusual. There's an American novelist that I was very influenced by, Flannery O'Connor. And Flannery O'Connor is a very, very good example of the inexplicable basis of grace, grace descending on the unusual and the inexplicable. And I think, without any shade of presumption, that would be my self-understanding of my own writing, that it's a vocation actually based on belief. It is no purpose. I would go back to my stuff in the Irish Civil Service, but it's where I'm called to write. where I'm called to make sense of what I'm writing. And even if I'm misunderstood or ignored or whatever, the deposit of the writing is on the table. So it's not for me to evaluate what the legacy will be. It could be completely redundant, utterly useless and stupid. Or it could have a window where someone says, oh, that's very interesting, that's useful. You don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to reinforce that point that Kieran's made. In terms of what is made of my work, as I hinted at. To me, my work is about one thing, and I find it interesting that people often, as I see it, misread my work. Would I talk to them about this? Absolutely not. So that's my response to their reading of my work. But once the work is out there, it's out there. So I see writing a book. It's almost like being a parent. You read.
Yes.
The book is your baby,
Absolutely.
and your role as a parent is to give it the wings so it can fly in the world on its own, make its own mistakes, have its own virtues, but it's not my book anymore. It's its own.
I completely agree with Keith. We're not there to have immediate success. We're there to be true to ourselves in terms of what we write.
Yes.
And this is what people expect of us. If you're a sociologist, you're expected to stand outside fashions, to stand outside trends and analyse them. You're not expected to embody them. Because if you embody them, you simply end up as a clone, a lemming, no use to anyone. You need a critical independence. And the critical independence in sociology that I find, and I do work in areas that are outside theology, so that I'm published in the British Journal of Sociology and so on. So, I don't have any problems with my credentials as a sociologist. I'm very fortunate that I'm in a very tolerant Department of Sociology, because having started on the Irish Civil Service in the 19th century, there are no immediate questions to ask about its relevance. It is utterly irrelevant. So that I had an apprenticeship in irrelevance and being solitary that was very, very good for writing on sociology and theology. And in the department, and sociology departments can, like any other places, be very intolerant. They also can be remarkably tolerant for letting people get on with things. And that would be the second reason why I'm loyal to sociology, that I've been left alone by my colleagues. And they don't quite understand why I sort of use my theology to Catholicism. But then another colleague arrives, a man called Tariq Madood. He writes on multiculturalism and Islam, so that to some extent I'm paving the way for him. He has a theological stance, Islam. My theological stance is Catholicism. One of the things that I tried to do, which might account for my anonymity to some extent, is I don't use blogs and I don't use sort of other my father was a journalist and news editor, and one of the things, he didn't say much about his job, but one thing that stuck in my mind was his ironic comment of the way that some people spend a fortune to get into the public domain, and they spend that fortune to get out of the public domain. So that I don't really want to fritter my writing into blogs and Facebooks and things like that. I don't write in newspapers simply because I will end up as a sort of aggrieved letter writer with idiosyncratic views. I would end up stereotyping myself. And it's much, much better just to stick to producing solid, big books that are impenetrable, are difficult to read, but someone will get a resonance. And occasionally you get emails from people saying, oh, I read your book and this really helped me. And that's really good.
This is how we met.
Yes.
One thing that I like about what you said, that we should be against all fashions and we should be faithful to truth, and
Yes.
I guess that this is what John Paul II would like as well.
Yes.
So thanks a lot for your time. Well, and that's it.
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.